Okay, Dave, do you want to call our meeting to order and ask for a roll call for us?
Oh, I can do that. I don't have the agenda in front of me, but yeah. So want to call the March 20th, 2025 Mill Creek Planning Commission to order. And so we'll start with a roll call, please.
Chair Nolan.
Present.
Vice
Remotely.
Chair Hamilton. Vice Chair Hamilton.
Present.
Commissioner Abrams.
Present.
Commissioner Barunda.
Present.
Commissioner Briles.
Present.
Commissioner Geiger.
Present.
Commissioner Schulte.
Present.
Okay, so we have a quorum. Next on our agenda would be the approval of the February 20th meeting minutes. And those were sent out in the second attachment to us all. Does anyone want to make a motion to approve those meeting minutes?
Motion to approve the meeting minutes.
We have a second on that?
I'll second it.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, minutes are approved. We have no hearings today. Now, next, I will turn it back to Justin because we have a briefing discussion on several housing amendments.
All right, good evening, everyone. So today's briefing or study session will be regarding the middle housing compliance, which we discussed briefly in the last meeting. So our goal today is to understand the state requirements we have to follow. And we will be looking at what middle housing is, what the state requires, we're reviewing the amendments, and then cover next steps and any questions. So first, what is middle housing? Middle housing is a form of housing that's compatible with single-family homes in scale and form. And we have adopted, well, proposed adopted the state's definition of middle housing, which I have on the slide here. So it's buildings compatible in scale, form, and character with single unit dwellings, including duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, fiveplexes, sixplexes, and so forth. The only difference with the definition proposed in the state's definition is that I included accessory dwelling units in our list, and the state does not include accessory dwelling units. And middle housing is actually fairly common in Mill Creek. Almost 20% of the housing stock is actually middle housing. Here are some more examples from the city. We have Nature's Landing, North Point, the Masters, Amberley, and Amberley. Any questions about what middle housing is? All right. So what is the legislation we need to comply with? There are 3 primary bills that we need to comply with by the end of June. One is HB 1110, and HB 1110, the goal is to increase middle housing in areas that are traditionally devoted to single family detached housing. Then HB 1337, which is was designed to expand housing options by using barriers to construction use of ADUs. And SB 5258, which was designed to increase the supply and affordability of condominium units and townhouses as an option for homeownership. That's what they were designed to do, but the actual rules that need to change are as follows. So HB 1110, what the city needs to change to comply is that we must allow at least 2 dwelling units per lot. We have to change our design review for middle housing from a design review board review to administrative design review. We need to alter parking standards near frequent transit. And we must ensure that development regulations are they are not more restrictive than for single unit dwellings. Next up, HB 5258, fairly straightforward. We just need to develop a procedure for processing unit lot subdivisions. Question is, what is unit lot subdivision? We'll get to that soon.
So I do have a question. This HOA property is exempt from this. Am I thinking of the right thing?
Yeah, well, I've got a
Okay.
slide on that. HOAs that had that banned middle housing before the effective date of HB 1110 and HB 1337 are exempt from requiring
Okay.
or for allowing them. Yeah,
So I have a question. How many HOAs are there in Mill Creek?
there are a lot. I do not have a definitive list.
Well.
There's one. There's a few big ones: MCCA, the parks, Highlands. But there's a lot of really small ones that may have just been from a small short plat where there's only 4 or 5 homes in the HOA. So as far as big ones, probably about a dozen, but there's lots of smaller ones.
So this is a great question, Commissioner. So the city used to maintain an active roster of HOAs. And in the past few years, that roster has not been maintained. So we're working on developing we're going through a process now of reaching out to HOAs and trying to repopulate that roster, get actual contacts. And part of that process is also going to involve a systematic process for trying to identify which HOAs have these provisions in place, as well as some other kind of rules, because as of right now, it's an information gap that we have, and we're taking active steps to try to resolve that information gap.
So there's a couple questions. Are the HOA bylaws similar to each other, or are they all unique?
A lot of them are, some are similar, some are unique.
Okay. And how many of those have the provision about 2023?
To be determined.
Oh, you see them here. Okay. So is the MCCA considered, because there were middle housing prior to 2023, so what effect does that have on the future?
So some HOAs are governing middle housing differently. Some HOAs, obviously, like the MCCA, for example, have a large portion of middle housing already in existence. What they're specifically regulating a lot of times could be accessory dwelling units, or they just provide additional design standards for their homes. I don't want to opine on what the specific regulations are on HOA regs, but I know that each HOA may govern their middle housing needs differently. And then obviously in some HOAs, in those residential areas that already have middle housing, they may allow. But again, it all depends, there's like a.
So the MCCA, like you were asking, that is exempt from further middle housing development.
If they adopted their regulations prior to that date.
And did the MCCA adopt it prior to 2023?
I believe so. Again, I'm not
We're exempt.
super familiar with their regulations.
Anybody who lives in that area is exempt.
Correct.
And I know it's not an exact number, but approximately percentage-wise, how much of Mill Creek is covered by HOAs?
Land-wise or population-wise?
I was thinking space-wise.
Gross, I think we're probably about 70% HOAs.
Yeah,
Said 70%?
70%
Okay.
land-wise that's like a very rough,
That's all I'm asking.
that's some
Yeah.
Kentucky windage right there.
most of the city is covered by HOAs, except for some notable exceptions are especially on the northern half of or portion of the city. But the MCCA and below is primarily all HOA, so it's around 70% would be good.
But I would venture to say that population-wise, it's probably a much lower number, as about 40% of Mill Creek comes in, it lives in some form of either middle housing or multifamily. So the
Okay. Yeah.
per capita, it's probably a little.
So,
their
so
population-
one final question. In the South Town Center that we're talking about, when you look at that area, and you look at the illustrations of middle housing that you've had in this document, is that what you're anticipating in that area?
The Southtown Center is zoned for, so again, I think the operative part of the definition of middle housing is at scale for blending within neighborhood residential,
Yeah.
low density residential. And, the Southtown Center is a tremendous opportunity that's, as of right now, zoned to allow 5 stories and is probably more
Okay.
mixed use, and is probably going to be of different types of land value. That being said, who knows? We're in the negotiating process with our consultant now. And part of that process of how we reach out, there could be, there's all number of interesting assortments of land uses that could be explored. Right now, we're trying to keep at this point in negotiation stage, trying to keep a open mind and letting the professional licensed architects kind of do their study, talk to the community, and develop the best course. But
So do you think it would be beneficial in your handout? Because I see the correlation between the types of middle housing that you've demonstrated here and in residential areas, but it does not necessarily apply to South Town Center. So would it be beneficial to inform the public that that's not really what you guys are thinking about doing in the South Town Center, because it's not zoned that way? It would be zoned for five-story buildings.
yeah, I think that's fair. I think we could probably make sure to clarify in our official correspondence and postings about Southtown Center as well as middle housing that the Southtown Center is going to be a mixed use area and probably not appropriate for maybe most types of middle housing types.
The amount of housing units we forecasted in the comprehensive plan, the only way to get there is multi-story. It's not gonna
Yeah.
be, not gonna be townhomes.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think that's a really good, clear message to get out at the very beginning. We aren't talking about a group of townhomes here. That's
That's not going to
Correct.
apply to the South Town Center.
it won't apply, and
Yeah.
let the public know as soon as they can. Yeah. Okay.
Just as a clarification, that 70%, I know you said Kentucky, I didn't actually hear what your term was, but I imagine it's the old country mile where I came from.
Correct.
It's, that 70% is of the area zoned residential. Is that correct?
Yeah, roughly.
Okay.
Of the land.
And not necessarily 70% of the land of the city of Mill Creek.
Although, if you look.
I realize those aren't very far apart,
It's
but
Yeah.
just so slightly different
right.
kind of a calculation, right? Because, for instance, the South Town Center is going from kind of like light industrial or commercial
Correct. Business park-ish.
business park to this very similar to what Town Center
Correct.
is zoned as.
It's all actually zoned the same now, technically.
Okay, so we, that's right, we have moved past that and the city has adopted that zoning change?
Yes, uh-huh.
Effective
Okay,
this year.
so South Town Center is now the same as Town Center, whereas it had been zoned business park. So we added a bit of residential into this area that was business park. Well, we added the ability for it to become
Mixed use.
mixed use, right, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to understand how that blends so that none of the 70% changed with those changes, right? We didn't add anything in there. This is somewhere that was business park allows now for some residences.
Correct.
Okay,
Yeah, but the significance for me is that the residential concept that you've got in your document is really not beneficial for understanding what's going to go out in the Southtown Center.
Yeah, and technically, middle housing is allowed in Town Center now. It's just not likely to develop that way because much higher densities are allowed. So I mean, these provisions, the middle housing provisions are mostly about providing a minimum density, whereas Town Center already exceeds that. So it's just not likely to develop that way. But it will be allowed if someone really wanted to do it currently.
And to be sure, when we do the town center master plan, we're gonna be working with y'all to develop additional design standards, additional controls. There's probably going to be additional changes to the development standards for the Southtown Center. The Southtown Center now is the minimum of what it can be of 5 stories, unlimited density. But after we go through the master planning process, it's potentially gonna be very different.
I just wanted to make sure I understood another thing. Tell me if I've got this right. So there's overlays of laws, of course, in the United States, federal law, state law, and on down. State law said that all of the currently zoned single dwelling unit lots must allow for ADUs unless they are within an HOA that already, that locked out ADU addition within that area. So our zoning will match what the state says. And then there's an exemption for anyone that had already, for any HOA that had that in place by, I think it was July something, 2023.
23.
So that's well in the past now, and if you had it, you had it, and if you don't, you don't. So one thing I want to understand is, my house is currently in the MCCA, for example, and it is a single dwelling, and we don't have any ADU. Per the covenant that I have with MCCA through the documents I signed when I bought the house, I am not allowed to develop an ADU on that because of that covenant. But the city is not stopping it. It is not the city that would enforce me not being able to do an ADU. It is my covenant with the HOA. Is that correct?
Correct. So if you came and applied for an ADU, we would say, hold on, talk to your HOA first, but we would still grant the permit if you insisted because it's not against our rules. And then enforcement would come down to the HOA saying, you can't do this. And
Per this thing that we had, and it is legally enforceable because we had it in place before July 2023.
Correct. We have no desire to interject ourselves in the HOA process.
Understood. But also you are not enforcing the HOA's rules or bylaws or anything like that either. You are enforcing the law that you are legally required to enforce, and that's where the buck stops, right? Okay.
Unless otherwise directed by code.
Can I ask a question? What was the reason for including ADUs in the middle housing definition when it wasn't required by state?
the way it all turned out, the change was minimal. I only did it because, in the definition, the only application of the actual term middle housing in code right now is for, unilot subdivision. And I want to allow ADUs to be unilot subdivided, so I include the definition. If we don't want to include ADUs in middle housing, that's fine. We can take it out and just add ADUs to the unit lot subdivision section separately from middle housing.
Is there any state metrics that we have to meet with respect to middle housing or ADU allowances that would be complicated by having a code definition?
There aren't, we aren't required to, we're only required to allow the densities, the middle housing densities.
So right now,
or
there's
it's
no
actually-
mandate to have a certain number, just the code has to allow.
Exactly.
And to be sure, middle housing, at least in other cities and regions that I've worked in, ADUs are often considered as part of the middle housing thing. It's not an uncommon inclusion.
One more, so for our population forecast we used to put the comprehensive plan together last year, did it include any capacity because of this?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Oh, like
Oh, do you mean like the?
Did we plan that middle housing is going to provide more capacity to take care of some of that mandated population we're going to get?
Yeah, we did take that into account, especially ADUs. It just wasn't a big chunk because
70% of the property is
exactly.
exempt.
I don't know the exact numbers, but we did have some growth in the
Okay.
rest of the, yeah.
Okay.
All right, last legislation, HB 1337 requires to allow 2 ADUs per lot. With some wrinkles we'll get into later. we must increase the maximum ADU size to 1,000 square feet from our current 800 square feet. We have to have aesthetic standards that are no more restrictive than for single unit dwellings. We have to limit certain impact fees for ADUs to no greater than 50% of what it would be for a single unit dwelling. And we need to adjust parking standards near frequent transit and remove owner occupancy requirements. All right, so we covered this a bit, but I'll just go over it again. Where do new requirements apply? So the minimum allowed density from HB 1110 applies citywide. The 2 ADUs per lot from 1337 applies in the NR and MDR zones. And the unilot subdivision applies citywide for non-stacked middle housing types. Non-stacked would be dwelling units that are not stacked vertically. So like a townhouse is stacked horizontally, they don't overlap. So those would be allowed for unilot subdivision. But say a triplex where it's 3 levels and each level is a dwelling unit, that you could not unilot subdivide that because they overlap and you can't get fee simple ownership of the dwelling units.
So you said 2 ADUs of no more than 1,000 square feet on
Yes.
a piece of property. That's a lot of ADUs on a relatively small acreage in Mill Creek. How can that even fathomably be thought of as logical? I mean,
Well-
that's big.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Backyards aren't that big.
Yeah, and there are, that doesn't override our bulk standards. So, we have setbacks from the rear and the side and the front. We have maximum, building height. Doesn't override those. So for a lot of lots, especially smaller ones, you just can't fit 2 in. It just won't happen. So what's more likely is that only the larger lot to be able to actually accommodate that much, or that size of ADUs.
And the 1,000 square feet is living space, not lot coverage.
Correct. Yeah,
Okay.
if you had a 2 level
500 square
ADU,
foot
you have 5 and 5.
footprint, still gonna be tight in most backyards. Still be
A lot of
impossible.
the new housing that's been built is on like 3,000 square foot lots, and that's like a 2,500 square foot house. So you have a 9,000 square foot lot, people are building things on that for single family houses in 3,000 or 3,200, so it's feasible.
A lot of ADU development also typically, the most common, like coming from San Diego, right? We had a big ADU program. The most common ADU we saw there was garage conversions. Or just, someone built a mother-in-law at one point and then, the mother-in-law passed away and then they put up a wall and now it's a new addition. So that's the other kind of common, the granny flat conversion as well.
There are several of them being built down in Magnolia where our kids live. And they had a deep lot right next to the Magnolia Park. And now they've got a new building with a garage. Yeah. And I wouldn't call it affordable housing, just for the record.
The concept I've been liking to use is affordable housing versus attainable housing. Affordable, that's for the deed restrictions, and attainable is maybe something that's a little, different price point.
Yeah. And then,
$800,000 units in the backyard.
And then the last point from the slide is that HOAs that are only allowed to prohibit middle housing and ADUs if the restrictions were in place prior to July 23rd, 2023. All right, so amendments review. So I'm going to go through each title and at a high level, talk about what was changed. And then I have the actual marked up amendments that I can pull up if you have specific questions we can dig into. And then in the markup of the amendments, I only included sections where there were amendments, and then every proposed amendment has a note that's either a required change by state law or a preferred change for some reason, like it's just better formatting or it meets Mill Creek standards better, but all those preferred ones are not strictly requirements, but just the recommendations.
Correct. The preferred amendments are ones where we're coming from an implementation standpoint of, if we had it written that way, it would be a lot easier from a land development standpoint to implement it.
Question there, you mentioned land, as land development, is it from the developer point of view or from our process part of it method?
For us trying to avoid gray areas in our code and eliminate our own potential loopholes and just our own process.
Okay, to be more clear so that any developer that comes upon our code is better able to understand it and submit something that is likely to pass, or know that what they want to submit would not pass and they move on.
Correct. We're striving for clear, consistent, and predictable.
For instance, our parking requirements were originally just a list, and I converted it to be a table because I think that's a little easier to read. That'd be an example of preferred change. All right, so Title IV was not a lot changed. We just moved the requirements for design review to Title 17. So we're trying to condense all the design review requirements to Title 17. Any
So is
questions?
that where the design review that's where they're documented?
Yeah, so in Title 17 now it says which development requires design review and who's doing that review, whereas originally it talked about that in Title 4 and Title 17. So we're just put it all in one place.
Okay, great. One spot to shop.
Make sure we don't have duplications that could result in complications.
Exactly. Next, Title 14. Title 14 changes were primarily definitions that were required for later changes in Title 16 and 17. One notable change was removing the owner occupancy requirement from the definition of ADUs, which was a requirement of state law. And other definitions just updated for formatting or clarity. Any
So
question with those
An
definitions?
ADU on a piece of, if you had a home and a ADU, it could be owned by a remote person and both of those could be rental units. And that's per state law stating that. We
Yes.
used to say the owner had to live in one of the units. Okay, I want to make sure I understand. Thank you.
Yeah.
I understand, and I may be wrong here, but in the MCCA homeowners covenants, people cannot rent out those homes. So can they rent out the ADUs, but they can't rent out the homes?
I'm not sure what the MCCA, say, we're not super spun up on their covenants or their
I just-
CCNRs, but
Anyone- Am I familiar, am I right?
Well, they're not going to be able, they're not going to be able to.
Yeah, you have to live in it for a certain amount of time that you can. If you've met the residency requirements, you can rent your home out in the future. But you can't just buy it and rent it. You have to have a occupancy time in the MCCA. Yeah,
I think it was it, I don't recall, but I'm not 100% sure, but I think it was 1 year, 12 months.
I think so,
Okay.
I don't know.
but it's not being enforced,
Different
But-
story, and again, and who enforces it is
the
the
MCCA.
covenant signers, not the city.
City.
That's what I want to point out. I want to bring us back to, they can have whatever rules they want. You can have agreed to whatever you want in your HOA, except for what's made illegal, like particular segregations, I think, in particular. But that's it. Like, and they're the ones that have to enforce it, not the city. So it is not our place to do that enforcement.
correct. State law, the state preemption here limits the city's ability to require a homeownership requirement.
Misuse of most of our taxpayers' funds to enforce
HOAs to,
rules.
So I do have a definition question on their major transit lot. I know that was one of the items in there. Just trying to understand if, I know it has a caveat about under construction. of if a transit agency has determined that they're going to build something there, at that point, they still wouldn't meet the minimum parking requirements if they haven't actually started boots on the ground?
Yeah, so I guess the way it's written has to be under construction. So if they have a planned stop, that wouldn't count as a major transit stop. But if it's actually under construction, or I'd probably assume it's permitted to be constructed, that would count.
Okay, maybe that might be a better, just definition, like permitted to be constructed, right? Because then you could go, when did I start construction versus when you applied for your own building permit?
Yeah, good point. It's a good point. It's ambiguous what under construction means here. This major transit stop definition is from the RCW, but the RCW actually has 2 or 3 different definitions of major transit stop, and I combined them all so it covered all the definitions. They're all slightly different. That's why I included that section about the one under construction. But I agree, it would be more clear to define what that means. We can make that update for the next draft.
Generally speaking, I guess within our process where that would be, right? Because we're the ones enforcing. So it would be, has been permitted or something like that would be a step, or, because they've got plans to bring a train up this way in 2048 or whatever. So are we enforcing to that? I don't
Yeah,
think so.
I would want, if we have the opportunity to build before a train gets here, we should build assuming that a train gets here. If that matches the definition. I think we're too far from where the trains are gonna be, depending on maybe the corner over here, or depending on if we do future annexations. Most of them are, I think, too far to meet the different standards, but if we ever get in that, that's something we'll wanna be on point on.
Yeah, and the only major transit stops in the city now are the stops on the orange and green lines along Bothell Highway 164th. Along 132nd, there is a silver line which will be coming in at some point in the future, but that's, I don't know how long out. Years.
We'll reach out to Department of Commerce to get clarity on what the technical definition of this is, because I'm sure we're not the first.
Or
city that
like, can we
has.
do something, it's in the transportation plan or something like that, those are projected out fairly far, but the intent is to build it there and put it to something from the transit agency's master plan.
We can report back on that specific information, and we can provide it to the commission.
And the county is developing a plan for light rail areas, 164th, Highway 99 and Airport Road.
Yeah, with the current, I think we're too far for it to affect any of the things in the changes based on the distance. But if we annex anything to where municipal gross area, we'd hit it.
Yeah. If it's already on the ground, you can't undo it.
Right now, that boundary is it a quarter mile or a half a mile?
There's one that's a quarter and one that's a half.
Yeah, that's what I,
There's both, depending on what we're talking about.
Okay.
Usually it's half a mile.
okay. Yeah, we could, within our MUGA, I guess, is what I would say. So it is entirely possible that could be a thing to consider. So future-proofing our code would be a good choice if possible.
I had a question on the cottage housing definition.
Huh?
When I looked at the RCW, I kind of read that the minimum of 20% of the size as open space should apply to both 1 and 2 and not just 2.
Could you make that a little bigger?
Yeah, absolutely.
I see you're straining your eyes to see it.
Think about how we feel.
Yeah, think about how we feel.
Okay, a little
Yay,
even.
thank you.
There we go.
Because I
Well,
think the only difference between 1 and 2 has to do with the ownership's part of it. But I think the part that sets cottage housing against some of the other ones is that has that space, open space contingent. So I think it should apply to both 1 and 2 and not just 2. And that's kind of how I read it when I read the RCW that this was taken from.
I think you are correct. I think Do you think it would solve that just by turning that 1 and 2 away from separate items? The RCW has it all, they don't break out 1 and 2 into different lines.
Yeah, so you either have to copy that and 20% minimum to 1, or you can do 1 and 2, and then all must have at least 20%. So some wordsmithing, but I think it's meant to be, you could say in the top definition, cottage housing means dwelling units on a lot with a minimum of 20% open space of lot side that either 1 is owned in common or 2 has units owned as condominiums with property owned in common.
I think that's a good way to do it. When I wrote that down, I was like, this is phrased oddly, but I think you're correct in your assessment. I'll make that change the next draft.
Okay.
All right, any more Title 14 questions? Okay,
We can go back to cottage housing. I think with that definition, I think my only pause is, what is the implication of making that change and what is the intent of cottage housing? Cottage housing is supposed to be a bunch of cute little small bungalows facing a common yard, and requiring each property have that 20% would essentially mean just two large single-family houses right next to each other is all you'd get, and you would call that cottage housing. I think the intent of cottage housing is supposed to be multiple properties that all share a big common yard, and that's supposed to be kind of what the cottage housing is supposed to be. That could be stylistic. I just wonder what the imposing the requirement of 20% per property versus just 20% commonly owned. That's kind of maybe a
Well, it could be like,
broader philosophical
it
question.
could be where you have like the tiny house concept and each one has their own little yard that's distinct versus it's depending on ownership. Does an individual own the house and the land surrounding it? Or does the individual own the house and then common with everyone else near it own the land and they share the land? So it's slightly different, but I think the intent is that they both would have land to use as open space.
yeah, the 20% common open space is, so if imagine you have a lot and then you want to put cottage housing on that lot, 20% of the lot size must be common shared space, not 20% per like unit. It's 20% of the total lot. You could then subdivide that for fee simple ownership using the lot subdivision, but the original parent lot has to be 20% open space at times.
So how much of the 20% is controlled by government easement?
By government what?
Government easements. Utility easements.
Oh, it doesn't really specify. It just has to be the open space. So I mean, if it's in an easement, it would be.
Or is that minus easements or inclusive of easements?
So I mean,
Because the reason I'm saying this is, since being part of this group, I've found out that the size of my property is less than the way it was articulated in
When you
sale
bought it?
documents. Because the degree to which the local community controls the front portion of your house or even portions of the back of your house, depending on where the utility easements are, is much larger than and a lot of neighbors feel. So just curiosity from this perspective, when you're talking about 20% of the open space, how do easements fit into that?
sure. So, I mean, so it says, I guess imagine you have a lot, and then there's gonna be a required, at least 20% of that total lot within the property lines would have to be a common open space. And if there are utility easements going under that common space, that's fine, as long as they're not impacting the ability to use it as a shared area for recreation or whatever.
I think if you have a 10,000 square foot lot, you can't have more than 8,000 square feet of building coverage. And the
and
easements,
lawn coverage.
Well, no.
Simply because part of that 10,000 feet is covered by easements. Where
But
the
yeah.
utilities can do basically what they want to do.
Well, that already exists, and like we talked about, for the properties that we've discussed. And then simple fact that the code that already says your house has to be this many feet back from the edge of your property line already takes up some of your property that you don't get to use as you see fit, I guess. And the fact that we limit it to 35 feet. Where are my air rights? And where are my mineral rights? How far down do I get? And I think in the case of MCCA, they get my mineral rights. But
That's a good point. Typically, utility easements are on the outside perimeter of the lot, which is already covered by a setback. So that likely wouldn't affect this. And we actually are considering having specific design standards for cottage housing and courtyard apartments, which would define, how big the common area could be, how it should be oriented. So it should probably be like centrally located on the lot and surrounded by the units, which mean the utility easement to be outside of that, not impacting it.
I'm glad you mentioned that. So actually, the state did, in their infinite grace, afforded us a corollary to develop additional design standards specifically for cottage housing to address these issues. We elected to maybe not include it in this specific code package just because, we got to get the regulations out to Commerce. We got to meet this June timeframe. However, this fall, we are doing a code update. And there are some potential additional planning actions requiring this that we can certainly introduce those additional design standards, just because recognizing that this is Mill Creek and we do hold ourselves to a higher standard in terms of design, in terms of quality, that we want to make sure that we're introducing those kind of higher quality design standards in these things. But at this time, we're just doing, just trying to get this, get in by the skin of our pants and just getting the bare minimum installed. And then we can go in and then do cleanup and provide the standard quality controls that we think Mill Creek deserves.
I might also add that the definition for cottage housing and courtyard apartments here is only used because it's in the definition of middle housing. We don't define, it's not used elsewhere in code at the moment, so it doesn't have an impact on what can actually be built right now. It's only because we had, the definition for middle housing had cottage housing inside, and so we wanted to define what cottage housing was. It doesn't actually impact what we can build in code now, unless we develop those additional design standards.
So one question I have is additionally, how does those design standards that we would apply to, for instance, cottage housing, a couple of slides back, you'd had that we are not allowed to apply more restrictive requirements than we do on a single dwelling unit lot. Is that, I might be confusing it, was that for the ADU on that same lot, or does that apply to cottage housing on a lot?
Great question.
Or any of the other things here, condominium, duplex, triplex?
Yeah, it depends on which requirement we're talking about. For ADUs in particular, you can't have an aesthetic requirement that's more than single unit dwelling. But for middle housing, the RCW specifically says you can develop design standards for these unit types.
Okay, thank you. And so that might actually be a reason to separate out ADUs from the middle housing definition, because now then those would cross, whereas they would have otherwise had a boundary between them because ADU was not listed in middle housing.
Yeah, it depends on how I write it. We could just specify under our design standards, cottage housing must have these and not call it middle housing. It's only, there's some ways around it, but that's a good point.
Well, it's interesting because all the residential structures don't have to go in front of the design review board. And now if we're gonna have, if these cottage housing have strict design guidelines and have to go in front of the design review board, that's more strict.
Well, what I was just gonna ask is, this is part of what I was trying to understand, I think, was that, we can't be more strict on ADUs than we can on single dwelling units. But we can on middle housing.
Well, middle
Is
housing,
that correct?
so middle housing still has to be administratively reviewed.
Oh, it is still an
Yeah, so-
administrative review. It does not go through design review board.
Correct, for middle housing.
Okay, you're right. I thought that,
But
I thought I was
design,
mistaken.
and
Okay.
even for the cottage housing corollary, you're allowed to have additional design standards for that, but I'm pretty sure that the corollary states that you can't like make them go through a design review board. The direction that we're getting from state is essentially every pathway that led to a design review board is getting closed. And so, that's kind of what's happening with a lot of the different housing standards. So, middle housing, administrative review, accessory dwelling units, I believe, the administrative review.
Okay.
Is that, okay, you mentioned, sorry, maybe it's just in the way that you said it, that all paths that lead to design review board are going to be closed. For residences, or all of them?
So you should
Because we
specify.
currently go
Okay.
through a lot with commercial and mixed use and things like that.
Well, I think later on in the code update, you're probably going to talk about that, right? Because you give definitions about what's within the purview of the design review board.
So I should specify, my comment was more the direction that we're seeing from legislative trends is increasingly more and more pathways to design review board are being closed. As of right now, wherever a pathway remains, we're seeking to maintain it. But just from what the proposed bills and the frequency and number of proposed bills and what they're comprising of, it's an emerging pattern, I would say.
So I've just got to ask the question. It's a crazy question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Where do you guys just hypothetically think cottage housing is going to be built in Mill Creek?
I mean, that's kind of the humorous part of this is we're, establishing a lot of discussion about a housing product that, maybe is applicable in less than 20% of the city, at which
Yeah.
point, I mean, that's the reality with middle housing in general, is if you look at the land use economics here, the average house in the Mill Creek is going for what, 1.2, 1.1 million? And, you'd be buying a 1.1 million, $1.2 million property, scraping it to develop 3 houses. It's just, your development costs and like, once you start doing your capital stacks and you start laying out the pro formas for this, it's, is there potentially a pathway forward?
Sure.
Probably. I'm not gonna opine on how big of a impact some of these bills are gonna be, but I think realistically, just based on land values, development is a very difficult thing if you can't get bulk and you can't get numbers.
And you'd end up with $3 million ADUs.
It's,
I thought the intent of middle housing was to try to get affordable housing, and I don't see how this is gonna really scratch that itch.
So I think actually one of the purposes of middle housing is to allow for a step between high-density housing, which is somewhere to live, generally speaking, not owned, to owning a smaller type of property before you get to a
Okay.
larger type of property, a
Like
more
one part of a
expensive
duplex.
type. So it's more about steps on the ladder than it is, we're all done. Like, that's it. I bought my forever home. I'm always happy in my tiny house, which someone might very well be. I'm not saying that you can't be happy living in a cottage court. That actually sounds cute as heck to me. And it might be great, yeah, but do you wanna live your whole life there? Are all phases of life correct for that? Which is part of what, the whole thing about the market for housing being is that people move through houses. Plenty of people in Mill Creek have bought a single dwelling unit here, lived in it for 20 years, raised their kids, and then moved on to a Rambler, and then moved on to well, yes, in fact, we have a few senior citizen villages types of kind of places, or they moved to Florida, yeah, where they've got a lot of those. So it's all about options, And this is trying to reinforce that we actually have that rung on the ladder,
Okay.
I guess is what I might say in the middle housing.
Okay.
When they talk about the missing middle, it's that there's a rung and then there's a big gap and then there's a rung. And you kind of look up at that gap and you go, how am I supposed to jump up there? And this helps provide some of those middle rungs. This is the way that I see it and how it helps with the idea of affordable housing. But it isn't affordable all by itself.
That's why I think, I kind of going back to my earlier comment about, I try to draw a distinction between affordable with a big A and affordable with a lowercase a, right? And that's why I like the term attainable housing more than affordable housing, because an affordable housing, when you think about affordable, there's typically associations of income requirements and a
Definitely,
deed
yeah.
restriction. And attainable housing is maybe a better term because it's maybe the housing product that's available for that new, they're fresh out of their nursing program or they're fresh out of law school or something, and maybe they're not ready to buy a $1.2 million house, but they might be able to get into a small town home or into a small home for that starter home. Or the other way to think about it is like, right, a lot of this conversation is often focused on people starting their lives. It's also, you can think about from the other side of the tunnel too, the so-called empty nesters that maybe don't need a 4-bedroom home anymore and they're tired of vacuuming 2,000 square foot of property, but they don't want to leave their community. They don't want to leave their friends and stuff like that. And so a lot of times middle housing is also a way for people to remain in their communities and downsize and be able to stay near their friends and their favorite shops and restaurants. So there's, it's not just a young family starter thing, but it's also a transitioning and being able to age in place.
And the 8 pictures at the beginning of the presentation were examples of middle housing, correct? Okay, that helps put it in perspective. I know somebody who lives in the point.
It's actually the interesting thing about middle housing, and sorry we're straying from your presentation, Justin, is middle housing is actually historically pretty common in America. It's about as American as apple pie in a lot of ways. If you think about like, small fourplexes, right? Just used to be very common, as it used to be ingrained in the urban form. And it really only went away in the post-World War II boom. And so the return of middle housing in a lot of ways is kind of a return to just how American cities used to be. But if y'all want to talk planning history, and I'm more than happy to come by my office and I'll chat your ear off.
I was going to say, we can do that, but off recording.
All right. So moving on, we get to Title 16. And the primary thing in Title 16, or the only thing, was adding a process for unit lot subdivision. So what is unit lot subdivision? I'm going to go over this definition here. So unit lot subdivision is intended to allow the creation of, I can't see my own screen with the sharing, of unit lots through established subdivision procedures, while generally only applying development standards to the parent lot as a whole rather than to individual lots. So what does that mean? Let's look at some examples. So here we have two lots where some middle housing has been built. And so let's say you have a 10,000 square foot lot, and then on that lot you stuck, say, this triplex and a single unit dwelling. If it's one lot, the only way to have home ownership of those triplex units without unit lot subdivision would be condominium. So you could build these 4 units on this lot and you could condoize it, but there's some downsides to it as a condo. It's not a fee simple ownership, and so if you want that fee simple ownership of your dwelling unit and the land under it, you can now use unit lot subdivision. So what that shows here is this orange line is where you can create new lot lines for these, what's the term I used? These unit lots. So the whole lot is the parent lot, and then it's been divided up into these 4 unit lots. The unit lots are able to break some zoning rules. So for instance, a typical lot has 5-foot setbacks on the side, but these unit lots don't have to have 5-foot setbacks because you're trying to have fee simple ownership, and these are connected buildings, so you can't do a setback. So they are allowed to break certain rules as long as the parent lot as a whole does not break the rules. So, and you can see here, you know, the parent lot has all the required setbacks. It has all the required lot coverage. All the rules are followed, but these smaller unit lots can break some of those rules to allow for ownership of that specific parcel and dwelling unit.
And in this case, the green space would have to be 20% of the 10,000. Is that the right definition?
Yeah,
Right
for the
interpretation?
cottage housing, the green space or, well, depending on, it's probably, this blue space would probably be
Oh,
a
okay.
common,
I was looking at the one on the left, but okay.
so the one on the left,
right.
you could have, I mean, it's flexible. You can have, with unit lot subdivision, you can have private space and common space.
You know,
The one on the left, it's all been turned to private space. These triplexes have small little backyards that's their own, and they own that land. The one on the right, there's that blue hashed area, that's a common space. So all these little cottage units, they have a little bit of their own space, which is theirs around their unit. There's also this shared area in the middle, which can be used for, you know, whatever the development as a whole wants to use it for.
And so there's
playground
going to
or
be new parking
barbecuing.
requirements put together. There's no room to park a car on there. There's not room for a park in that, unless the blue area in the center is a parking garage. What?
It's within a quarter mile of the bus stop. You don't need it.
Don't need any parking.
And you could have a drive aisle coming through here, a shared owned drive aisle with parking off that. This one doesn't just show that, but there's,
Okay.
for most of our middle housing, there's gonna be parking requirements, so there would be some parking on these cottage units somewhere. It'd probably be more likely to be by the alley or the street, and then a shared parking area with individually assigned parking spaces, but it's
Okay.
So where is there an alley in Mill Creek?
very few, or I don't think there are any.
He said he didn't think there were any. Sorry, I spoke up.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear it. I'm deaf.
I don't know of any alleys in Mill Creek, at least yet.
Shaughnessy, just outside of Mill Creek, has alleys. Shaughnessy neighborhood, it's just across 35th. In Seattle Hill, they have alleys in their development.
But they're not in Mill Creek.
They're not in Miller Creek yet,
It might,
at
I'm
current
not
boundaries.
sure what the technical definition of an alley is, but there is one I can think of in the eGov. There is a private road that's used that is maybe alley-like. That is, I think it's labeled as 133rd. That could be considered an alley, maybe.
Everyone goes down to Seattle and has friends with alleys,
Yeah, alleys are much more,
where you can put a half of a car in the
Yeah.
garage.
And that's where the ADUs are being built, is where the access is off of the alley, down in Magnolia. Okay.
yeah, alleys are much more common in cities with street grids, rather than cities with cul-de-sacs or Mill Creek, because it's just the way that the street network
Mill
works.
Creek was not developed on a grid pattern.
Correct.
And can you imagine alleys being back? All those houses.
Well, if we had alleys, that's where all the MCCA trails are.
Okay.
Is where, if you replace that with an alley, with wide
Okay.
enough for a road, for a car to go on, that's an alley.
Okay.
I'm proposing, but I can imagine a few of those that basically could be alleys.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions with Title 16 and unit lot subdivision? All right. Moving on to Title 17. So Title 17, the main changes were, one, update the density calculation to always allow 2 units per lot. And to do that, actually just created a new density calculation section to do that. Other changes were aligning lot sizes with density. That was a preferred change. It wasn't a required change. Aligning mixed use, high density residential uses with high density residential uses. This was another preferred change, not a required change. And then updating standards for ADUs, including increasing the maximum size, increasing the maximum number, 2, having alternative setbacks for alleys, which again, does not really apply to Mill Creek, but we had to include it. Removing aesthetic standards and allowing home occupations in ADUs. That home occupation was a preferred change, but it made sense.
Can you explain that terminology?
Yes. so a home
Occupation by
occupation-
whom?
Home occupation is when you have a home business. Our home occupation guidelines currently only allow one home occupation per lot. And so you could have a home business in your ADU or your principal residence, but not in both. We felt that restriction doesn't make as much sense if you have, say, 2 ADUs and a single unit dwelling. You basically would be saying to all the people in the ADUs, sorry, you can't have a home-based business. And we don't want to discourage people from being entrepreneurial. So that was why we did that change.
I think it is.
This harkens back to a specific question that had been asked, and so
Let's see.
my fellow commissioner is looking up to see specifically, oh, wait, was that, it brings that to mind, so we're gonna double check that that
Which
is
section
appropriately
was it
matched.
in?
You'd said Title 17?
Title 17.
Yeah, trying to find the right page because we have multiple Title 17s. Let's see.
Are you looking in the amendments?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's shared parking.
In the future, I think it would be helpful, we say Title 17. What is the generic title for Title 17?
Yeah.
Title 16.
Okay, 17.
We don't have those committed to memory.
Great comment, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Title 17 is zoning. Yeah, I'll include those names next time. Are you looking at the home occupation section?
Yeah. 20, section 23, 17.23. Yes, okay. What is Group B and Group A occupations? That was
A
different.
Group A home occupation is one that does not have any non-resident employees, and a Group B home occupation is one that has a maximum of one employee who does not live in the home.
Okay,
And we only allow up to one non-resident employee.
okay. So can the business have multiple employees, but only up to one non-resident ever work in the housing? They can work other places. So you could have a
So, like-
business with like 5 employees, but all 5 employees work in their own separate houses. But one person lists their house as the address.
So it's at the location. So like, say you had a couple who live together and they have one employee for their business that they run.
Mhm.
They both live in the home, so they don't count as non-resident employees, but the employee they hire that comes there every day, that would be the one allowed employee.
Okay, but if they have multiple employees, but none of them come there, that'd be fine.
Yeah, the reasoning behind having a limit is to limit impact to the neighborhood. And so if you're not physically coming to the location, it's not impacting the neighborhood.
So what's the neighborhood near the sports park? South of the sports park? Where there are little offices on the first floor. And I don't know if people live on the second or third floor. But there are little office spaces in the first floor.
Yeah, I think there are some live work units over there. I'm trying to remember the exact name of that development.
And it's just north of the Hawthorne Apartments?
Yeah,
And
it's,
south of the
Matrix
Reserve?
Landing, I believe.
The reserve,
Also the ballpark.
the reserve, I think.
Is it part of the Reserve?
I think
Or
it's
is
part of
it?
the reserve.
Okay.
So what this says is that for Group B, where you have one employee and one non-resident employee, a husband and wife couldn't have 2 different businesses and each be a Group B.
I mean, if they each have their own business,
Mm-hmm.
so,
You could have multiple Group As, you could have a Group A and a Group B, but you couldn't have 2 Group Bs.
Yeah, let me look at so I was saying, are you, okay, so let's say, I need to pull up that definition. I don't remember if it allows
'Cause it-
multiple per dwelling unit. or
Yeah,
smaller per dwelling
D
unit.
says only one group B home occupation permit may be in effect at any one time with regard to any residential dwelling unit.
Mhm.
So a married couple can't both be a group B in the same house.
Correct. As now written. We don't want to touch it too much because it's not really heavily included in the purview of middle housing. We do want to look at our home occupation rules at a later date to modernize them. They were written before telework was a big thing.
Yeah, it seems a little unmodern.
It's on our to-do list.
Yeah, so I believe I briefed y'all maybe back in January that we'll be doing the annual code update, where the whole point is to identify little provisions in our code where we just kind of think like, wait a minute, why do we do that? And this is probably a good example of something that we could implement or we can try to change in a future annual code update.
So people working at home, that's not considered a home occupation, is it?
If they're a consultant and they own their own business, they are home occupation. If they're an employee who's only teleworking, they would not be home occupation.
What about 1099 employees?
I think that would be a home occupation.
Okay.
So the reason I mentioned that, those units south of the, sports park is because there does appear to be commercial activity going on the bottom floor.
Mhm.
But they also, in the way they design those units, there's clearly parking spots.
Mhm.
Okay, so people can live there and also have patrons come in to deal with the commercial activity.
For that,
Go ahead.
I would say for that specific property, we can also look at the zoning. I'm not sure if that's zoned for neighborhood residential and
I thought they were designed to be live-work
I was
buildings
gonna say,
purposely.
I was gonna say, that sounds like what you're describing as live work. And, maybe that's, I'm not, we'd have to pull up the zoning for that specific area and what the primary and
So what I'm
secondary use is.
trying to get to in a very long way, is that when you're talking about, an ADU or an what do they call them? ADUs, yeah. Used for commercial activity, people are going to use those ADUs potentially for business. Where are patrons going to park?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's a couple answers. One is ADUs are not allowed. So a home occupation is a secondary use. So it's not allowed to be more than 50% of the square footage of the building. So like if you have an ADU and you want to run business out of it, you can't use more than 50% of that ADU for your business.
Would that only be if it's segregated? But if it's not segregated, I build an AEDU, the 50% would apply to the whole built environment, the primary house and the ADU.
Correct. Yeah.
And it's only if the ADU is separate unit lot
Mhm.
that if 50% would apply.
But still, you can use it you can limit it to 25%. I don't care what you're talking about. The point of the matter is that commercial patrons are going to come in to the business and they're going to conduct business. So where will they park?
I need to review the specifics of home occupations. I can't remember if there's a parking requirement or not. I do know, however, that retail activity is not allowed in home occupations, specifically to avoid having lots of people coming in. And you're limited to 5 customer visits per day. So only 5 people can come to your home occupation per day as a max. So you can't have a stream of people. It's going to be, less than 1 per hour. If you still say you're like a counselor, you can have 5, people coming to get counseled.
So
per day.
say it's a wonderful candy store,
Mhm.
just
Retail.
fantastic. Is the owner of that candy store gonna be telling people, I'm sorry, you can't come in because I'm limited to 5 a day?
Well, you can't have, retail is not allowed, so you can't sell anything on site. It has, if you can
Oh, so
manufacture
you
your
can
candy.
consult and sell it offsite.
Yeah, you could sell it online or wholesale, but you can't sell it on site. And that's to prevent this stream of customers from
So
coming in.
with my wonderful candy store, I have to have someone who is either myself or an employee park his car somewhere
Mhm.
and then do delivery of my wonderful candy somewhere else.
Yes, yes. And I believe there's a parking requirement for home occupations. Let me just double check in our code. One moment.
I think we brought a lot of really good points to be thought of as we go through this code revision this year. I don't know how much more we want to really try to discuss it this evening.
They brought up the point that home occupation is an area they want to look at in the fall. It's not as immediately impactful on the middle housing. As, if we're gonna, if we're talking about modernizing our code to match the state law, we have to do that pronto. And then it'll take time for something to be developed. And then someone might try to establish a home occupancy or a home business. But by then, we will have already gotten it so that it is regulated correctly. Is that what you're telling me?
That is the intent.
All right.
And I did look it up. Home occupations are required to have parking for customers on site and not on the street. So you have to have off-street parking if you want to have.
People are going to ask questions.
Mhm.
I'm simply asking a question.
Mhm.
I'm not expecting you to have an answer. Okay, but people are going to ask questions. There was the last council meeting where a nice woman asked the question to the council, when are you going to demonstrate to me what you're doing in the Southtown Center? Nobody on the council said a word. So Miss Old Lady said to herself, nobody's helping me. These are questions that people are gonna deal with. We're gonna have to have answers. Not us, but the council is gonna have to have answers. That's all.
So I know we don't have a city council member liaison present right now, but the city council holds rules to themselves that they don't respond directly to any public comment. That they're not
Being-
supposed to, so that nobody responded. And I'm like, well, yeah, they're not supposed to. They are supposed to hear it and then discuss it with the city manager, if anything, and see if they can get staff to provide a response. That's the only thing about, and I mean, I don't know about specifically the answer to that question, but they hold themselves to not actually answer specific questions that are brought up in a hearing or in the
Old
public
lady's
comment.
gonna go back to her friends and say, they didn't answer my question.
Yes,
And it's
Per
gonna spread
policy.
around and it explodes.
Yes.
Because no one gave her an answer.
because
So, and.
people
we don't
regularly
have
don't
to be
understand how their government works.
Responsible for answering questions from the public.
But to be sure, these are good questions and we will be happy to evaluate them further. And parking considerations are certainly going to be a major point of contention as there are already future state preemptions occurring that will further regulate parking requirements as well.
Questions aren't asked for purposes of attack. Questions are being asked solely because other people are gonna have the same questions or other questions and they're gonna want answers before their community starts to go crazy.
Understood. I agree. I think questions are good. And we'll be happy to dig into them further and get more technical responses.
All right, so Title 17, for the most part, we tried to do the minimum changes necessary to comply with state law as a general rule. But there were a couple of policy choices, which we wanted to bring to your attention. One of those involves a apparent conflict between HB 1110 and HB 1337. Because I'm going to try to explain this. It took me a long time to figure out what was going on, but I'll do my best to explain. So HB 1110 requires allowing at least 2 units per lot but it specifies that cities can choose whether or not to allow ADUs to count towards that 2-unit per lot limit. HB 1337 requires allowing 2 ADUs on lots with a single unit dwelling. So I have a couple diagrams here. On the left is if you do not count, or sorry, on the left is if you do count ADUs towards the density requirement, that 2 units per lot. So you could have, let's say, you could build a duplex, 2 units together, or you could build a single unit dwelling, but you have to be allowed 2 ADUs because of HB 1337. If you do not count ADUs towards the 2-unit per lot density, you would be allowed the 2 units, a duplex, plus 2 ADUs because of 1337, or 2 units and an ADU. We opted, well, I won't say what we opted for yet. Let me go to the next slide. So, I just explained it. Option 1, as I said, ADUs count towards the required unit density. Option 2, they do not count towards the required unit density. We opted, at least in this draft, to go with a middle path between those two, where we do a modified option 1. So we say ADUs count towards unit density, but all lots are allowed at least 1 ADU, which is consistent with current regulations. So right now, all residential lots are allowed an ADU. We didn't want to take that away, so we did this modified option 1. So you can see these check marks are for unit configurations that would be allowed, and the X is for a unit configuration that not be allowed.
But I could, instead of a duplex, have a sixplex and an ADU?
Yes, if you had a big enough lot that you were allowed
Yeah.
6 units on it. The way that the density calculation is written is you take your, the density of your zone, which in neighborhood residential is 6 units per acre, and then you multiply that by what fraction of an acre your lot is. So if you have a quarter of an acre and you have allowed 6 units per acre, you would be allowed, well, it's what, 1.5?
2 units.
You had to run up to 2 units. But let's say you had a small lot. You only have, say, 1/10 of an acre. It's small. The density says you're only allowed 1 unit, except the minimum is 2 units. Well, let me pull up the actual code I wrote, because that'll make it more clear. To make it more clear. Hopefully more clear. Okay, density calculation. Oy. Okay. Somewhere. Not there. Here we go. So here's how we determine the density. So you take the net developable area and you multiply the net developable area by the number of dwelling units per acre required by the zone. So if you have 1 acre lot and you're allowed 6 units per acre, you get 6 units. Let's say you have 1/10 of an acre, that would be, less than 1 per lot, but you're always allowed 1 per lot. So, but HB 1110 requires a minimum of 2 units per lot. So that's where these exceptions come in. Exceptions being the maximum number of dwelling units allowed per lot in residential zones is never less than 2. So you always get 2 units per lot, so it comply. The next exception is the maximum dwelling units allowed per lot is never less than 3 if 1 or more of the dwelling units are accessory dwelling units. This is maybe not the best phrasing. I'm still contemplating a way to make this more clear, but it's just really complicated. But what it works out to is on this chart, the minimum, let's say there's small lots. You're always allowed 2 units, so this would be good, this option down here. If you have a single unit dwelling, you're always allowed 2 ADUs per 1337, so this one's good. This one would not be allowed because you only get 2 units per lot, or a maximum of 3 units per lot if you have an ADU. This has 4 units, so not allowed. This would be allowed because there's 3 and one's an ADU.
So then the 6 bucks can't have an ADU.
It cannot have an ADU. Let me check the 17. I may need to rephrase this.
Wouldn't it still apply based on the calculation of the density, right? Like if you have a big enough lot, you could have the 6plex plus the ADUs. It's just a matter of, do you meet the calculation, right? Like if you have more than an acre, I think your calculation could work out to that ADU being allowed.
Yeah, I mean, if you had a lot big enough for 6 dwelling units, you could do 5 dwelling units in an ADU, or 6 dwelling units. You're right. I have a loophole that needs to be fixed if we want to always allow 1 ADU per lot. That's a question for planning commission. Do you think we should always allow an ADU on all lots, even if there is middle housing already there, say 2, 3, 4, 6 units?
And Justin, correct me if I'm wrong, we coordinated with Department of Commerce and we confirmed that we could either just say, look, you can do 2 middle housing units or you can do 2 ADUs. That's the bare minimum, lowest level of development intensity that was acceptable by Commerce, correct?
Yeah, I mean, we are compliant with state regulations.
So
The way it's written right now, if you're allowed 6 units and you built a 6plex, you couldn't add an ADU. If you were allowed 2 units per lot, because you have a small lot, you could do 2 units plus an ADU. You're getting like an extra bonus. The reason is because if you look, this option here on the top left, 1 unit and 2 ADUs is functionally the same as 2 units and 1 ADU, with some very minor differences. The few differences would be an ADU can only be 1,000 square foot, and a duplex could be more than 1,000 square.
And then in either scenario, you're creating 3 homes
Exactly.
where there was once 1.
So in the top left example there, the unit with 2 ADUs, is that equated to a minimum lot size?
This will be allowed on all lots.
So if you have 1/10 of an acre,
Mhm.
a 4,000 square foot lot, you can put 3 dwelling units on it.
Yes,
That
if you,
doesn't make any
if you
sense.
comply with the setbacks and the maximum lot coverage, which is pretty unlikely.
I think this comes back to what was mentioned a little bit earlier. There's what where we allow people to do versus what economically someone will actually do, right?
The most likely scenario that you're talking about, where people are putting 3 homes on there, is you have a house with a garage and you got a backyard. What is likely to happen is the garage will become an ADU to a little studio, and then you might have a structure in the backyard or something that has an access. So then that's probably the most economically feasible way to do it.
Okay.
Yeah, so as written now, you're only allowed the 2 ADUs if you have a single unit dwelling. And then you only get an ADU this is I can't explain how complicated is it. Basically, single unit dwellings get 2 ADUs. Multi-unit dwellings do not get an ADU unless they are under their density limit, or if they only have 3 units on a lot. So this would be allowed. This would be allowed. This or greater would not be allowed. You can't have
So the density applies to the lower left corner, but does the density apply to the upper right corner too then?
Yeah, so yeah, on the left side, this was what's required by state law if you do count ADUs towards your unit density.
Yes.
On the right, only this top option is allowed as an exception. Anything else would not be allowed. So you can't have a duplex, or you couldn't have like a triplex and two ADUs, or one ADU. You could only have 2 units per lot. If we're assuming this a small lot size, you only get 2 units per lot, unless you have a single dwelling with 2 ADUs, or a duplex with 1 ADU.
So if I'm understanding correctly, the policy intent here is in any given of these scenarios, you know, you're not allowed to add more than 2
Mhm.
to to a single dwelling unit, so that you're always gonna arrive at 3, essentially,
3 or less.
because of the requirement of the ADUs.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the size of a single dwelling unit on the left side, on the top,
Mhm.
is what do you consider to be the size of that unit?
Well, the ADUs have a
No,
maximum
not the
size of 1,000
ADU, the
square
unit,
feet.
the unit.
The unit could be any size.
The unit has to be larger than the ADU.
It has to be bigger than the ADU.
So is there any kind of limitation in terms of the number of people in the unit?
There is no limitation other than what would be in the fire building codes. So the building codes have certain minimum dwelling unit sizes, minimum bedroom sizes, and maximum occupancies for how many people can live in a unit.
So in the ADU, same question, is there a limitation on the number of people?
Same as in the primary unit.
And I may be wrong here. Didn't you indicate that the maximum size square footage is for an ADU is up to 1,000 feet?
Yes,
Square
100.
feet?
And I think there's a minimum of
And a minimum of 400 square feet.
400.
The minimum is 400 square feet for an ADU.
Are there a lot of cities that are looking for this hybrid option, or are they preferentially going one or the other? I mean, what's the true motivation to make it more complex with the hybrid?
It's a little hard to say because most cities are waiting to the last minute to pass their legislation like we are. From what I've seen, most are going with option 1. I mean, I didn't look at a lot of cities because they haven't passed it yet. We could not allow this option here, but then it just seemed odd because there's functionally a little difference between a duplex with an ADU and a single dwelling with 2 ADUs. You're just getting 3 dwelling units either way. We thought, why artificially limit it?
But it gets more complicated as you go bigger.
Sorry, say again.
It just gets more complicated as you go bigger. And the only thing that you gain from calling it a 3 units instead of 2 units with an ADU is what? If we've streamlined any middle housing and the ADUs have the same streamlines, what's functionally anything different between calling it 3 units on the lot versus 2 units in an ADU? Is it more that I can do the ADU after the fact?
Yes, having an ADU after the fact is one of the differences. There are some minor differences about in design review. Like we could have design standards for duplexes that wouldn't apply to an ADU. So it might be preferable if you want design standards to allow a duplex with an ADU rather than force it to be a unit or a single unit with 2 ADUs. Functionally, there's very little difference.
But with your direction, we can absolutely adopt we could just say, yep, you can do 2 ADUs or you could do 2 primaries, one or the other. And as we understand the guidance from Commerce, that would be simpatico with what they want. And we'll find out.
So why not just do something that's simplistic? I mean, everyone's gonna understand it.
Yeah, personally, I'd lead to the first option and not the modified, just because it gets complex more than what we could imagine. And if there's little functionally different between calling it a unit versus an ADU, except for the right to do it after the fact, I really don't see the motivation to put it in there.
Yeah, I mean, we can certainly rewrite it that way. It would just mean that if you built, it kind of comes down to phasing. It would mean that if you built a duplex, you then couldn't come back and add an ADU. You just duplex is it. So if you don't think, if you're thinking ahead, you would want to do a single unit dwelling with 2 ADUs if you ever wanted to have 3 units.
So don't you think it's the more complicated, I mean, this is a very complicated issue that you're talking about.
Mhm.
Okay, just trying to grasp it and understand it, okay, is very difficult. Don't you think a developer or a homeowner is going to get confused regarding this? And if a homeowner is or a developer is somewhat competitive, you may hire a lawyer, and the lawyer may tear you apart because of the confusion of this. Why not simply make this simple? Just come to a conclusive decision amongst yourselves as the planners and the developers inside and say, this is what we can do. I'm sorry, you can't do anything else. Just make it simple.
But I think what I was
And
hearing
make
earlier,
a
it's
decision what
actually
you
our
want as for
direction that we're
simplicity,
asking though.
but
We're
just
the
do
ones that
it.
actually provide that direction request.
Yeah.
Like Justin gives a suggestion, but we're the ones that actually provide the direction to Justin. Do we want picture 1, 2, or 3?
Asking the staff to put together their
That's staff,
recommendation.
it's not our
and bring it
decision,
to
it's the
us.
staff's
And
decision.
I,
Again, I'm just saying, it's complicated. The more
when it
complicated
comes to
you
us,
get,
there's
the
only
more,
only
the
one of
more
the 4 pictures.
conflicted you're gonna get. So make it simple.
Yeah, I think, and we can certainly simplify it more. I think a lot of confusion comes trying to explain it with a lot of different, explain all the ways we could have written it as opposed to how it's actually written. The way it's actually written is, I think, easier. You do this calculation to get how many, you basically, when you look at this, this section, subsection A says, here's how many units you get per lot. That's the calculation. Then subsection B says, you always get 2. Or if you have an ADU, you always get 3. I think that's easier to understand once you look at that calculation.
Justin, you guys do pre-application meetings in the city, right?
Yes.
So if someone comes in with an idea, they're gonna know all the stuff. There won't be any confusion. You guys will tell them, right?
Mhm.
If I'm understanding if I'm reading the room correctly, it sounds like there's a desire for a more simple, more easy to understand code implementation for this, even if that requires ultimately maybe less immediate units and maybe there could be some implementation days of phasing. However, if I'm understanding everything correctly, we want to go for a more simple, easier to understand implementation. So we will evaluate the code using that direction, and when we bring it back to you next month, we can finagle the language from there, or we can move it forward. I just want to make sure that we're moving forward, because I think this is a complicated thing, and I think that I tend to agree with y'all that, I think it might just be easier to say 2 units, 2 primaries, or 2 ADUs, your call, or 1 primary and 1 ADU, no more than 2, but.
Could I ask that you go back to the code requirement, the state code that says what we had to do? I think it was actually a different, the middle compliance study. Right? Right. So this says you have to allow at least 2 units per lot. And then the other one requires allowing 2 ADUs on lots with a single unit dwelling.
Mhm.
It looks like the way you're writing the code says parceling out the child unit lots is the first step, maybe in an algorithm. And then beyond there, on that same parent lot, you may be allowed up to 2, I guess you're required to have 2 ADUs to allow up to 2 ADUs. That's another thing I wanted to clarify. We're not saying that if I don't like my house anymore and I want to knock it down, I'm not required to build a house and an ADU in replacement, right? I can still just build a house.
Mhm.
I am still allowed to just build 1 single unit on my property. Okay. So maybe the thing is that we go through steps because you've got that calculation where you have a density, and then you say, and now we talk about how many of those can be ADUs, but maybe it's as simple as when you get to something like a sixplex, it's got, if you decide to build a sixplex on this property that can only be subdivided down to 6, we're done. You can't add an ADU to that, right? Because now we're at too many subdivisions. But how does that square with HB 1337? Well, you didn't have a single unit. How does that square with HB 1110? Well, you have more than 2 units, so that seems like you're already done. You went through, you're already max density. You can't add an ADU.
If you
Is
Yeah,
what it
so-
seems like to me in that
have a
case.
triplex, you've complied with HB one.
Applied with both.
Yeah, I think I might, what I might suggest in code is that it goes through first the density calculation, and that allows up to whatever. So if you could fit a sixplex on there, and you decide to put a fiveplex and an ADU, okay, you're still within 6 units. That's the maximum density we allow on this full size on the parent lot.
Mhm.
And then it can go up to 2 classified as ADUs. So if they wanted to do a 4-plex and 2 ADUs, that's okay too. If they wanted to do a 3-plex and 3 ADUs, no.
Yeah, I mean, that's,
Is
That's
that
how
that
it-
where we're talking?
yeah, that's.
But
how
I mean,
it's
that's what the
actually
code
written.
says right now. I think what Justin was sharing there, it's steps 1 and 2 there, it's what you're saying. You figure out your lot size, he gives a definition for lot size, and you do a calculation for the allowed maximum number of dwelling units. I don't know, maybe it's just a matter of semantics of the number of dwelling units splitting between the ADU counting towards it or not, but I think otherwise, I think he's met your intent there.
I guess maybe in your question of should we include ADUs in the calculation density, I think yes. Should we include it in the, I think the original question you'd asked was, there are 2 options. I think option 1, and I think Commissioner Schulte also recommended that too. So if you're looking for guidance, I don't know if you want us to call a vote on that, if it's not on our agenda, or if you just want us to informally guide you. But I think 2 of us have said option 1 seems like the path to go forward with, and not a modified option 1.
Okay, we can do that. So that will involve to do that, it will involve only one change, and that change is, in this section here, you change the, where it says, the maximum number of dwelling units allowed per lot is never less than 3 if 2 or more dwelling units are accessory dwelling units. That's only, we just change 1 word, and that will make it a pure option 1.
And that'll make it simple enough for you to explain to us. And then maybe when the public's here, they'll understand it also.
They may be smarter than we are.
Yeah,
They might be.
I'm not sure if we need a motion, but I think I agree. I think, as I stated before, my intent with the code long-term is that we try to create the most clear, consistent, and predictable code we can come up with. And I agree that this is probably the most clear, consistent, and predictable.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily reach to do more than what we're required because the state hasn't recognized and given us credit for what we've already done. So I don't want to put us in a situation where we end up doing more and get 0 credit for it again. Because this is the first stage of them trying to build more housing, and it's not going to be the last.
Yeah, I mean, the only reason I had a modified option 1 was that, to me, it doesn't make sense to allow a unit and 2 ADUs, but not 2 units and 1 ADU. It's the same number of units, but if changing 1 word, that's fine.
Easy fix.
And
I think you're
we
following
wanna
the
have-
intent of the law and not necessarily the wording of the law. And I'm going to recommend following the wording of the law when it comes to writing code.
Mhm.
And this is on our agenda as a discussion item tonight. I don't think we want to have a motion and make a decision because we haven't had the public here and we've had a discussion and you've heard us.
Yes.
Please proceed.
Come back with a recommendation that
Okay.
think we'll like.
All right, Title 17, additional Title 17 review. The off-street parking chapter was reorganized. And that reorganization involved converting all the parking minimums to table format instead of just a straight list. And then the parking minimums for some uses were reduced near
I
frequent
think it
transit stops
does. Let's see.
as required by 1110 and 1337. And then administrative design review for middle housing was instituted. So
That's delete.
design review board approval or design review by design review board was already required for any multi-unit dwellings.
Yes.
But now multi-unit dwellings that are also middle housing are required
is on this one.
administratively rather than by DRB. They still get reviewed with the design review guidelines.
Yep.
It's just by staff instead of the DRB. And that was a requirement of 1110.
Will apartment complexes still go to the DRB then?
Yes, anything over 6 units would go to
Anything
DRB
over
still.
6 units,
Mhm.
okay.
It doesn't say that.
All right, and we touched on this earlier. There's more policy choice, which we like, not a motion, just a sense of what the planning commission is interested in. The middle housing legislation allows certain design standards for middle housing, such as size limits for cottage housing, minimum private open space requirements, or window and facade articulation or pedestrian access. There's a picture of what some of those design standards can evolve. This one is talking about building articulation. We already have design standards that need to be followed as part of our design review guidelines that the DRB or staff would review, but we think it would be beneficial to tailor them for a specific unit, middle housing types such as cottage housing or card apartments, where the design, the layout is important to get a good product that is very livable. So we were going to, staff recommends doing that, but we didn't have time to do it before the deadline, so we're going to bring it back at a later date. That's something that
I
planning
would
commission
be
would
amicable
interested
to
in.
that. I mean,
Yeah.
based on the discussion we've been having on lots of these issues, obviously we want to
If-
take some time to think it through.
I agree with time to think it through.
Sure. All right.
I would also recommend when we do the design, when we bring forward that design standards, this would also be an important thing that we want to be able to have time to integrate the design review board and be able to have partners and other volunteer boards as well to contribute and to lend their expertise.
Yeah, most likely we would put together a proposal, bring it to design review board to get their opinion on how that would work out. And then once they've got, we've got feedback from DRB, then bring it to planning commission.
And sorry, Justin, I have to go back on the parking provisions. I'm wondering if you might accidentally be missing the words minimum as it relates to the non-residential parking section of the code. Sorry, we were just reviewing it from Commissioner Sumsey.
172750.
And I know we saw, we just looked at, we saw it in the residential, but we didn't send that wording in the commercial.
Uh, Seventeen 27 50 reach long section. Okay. Where was the, sorry, where's the missing word?
Is it the minimum or should it be the minimum required spot there, like under that sentence there?
Like
Yes,
A.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right, otherwise you're demanding that they can only have that amount of spots, right?
Yes, yeah, it's a great call. or
Yeah,
great
and then I had in part on page 73, under alternative parking, where we say no greater than, I think there's missing a word in one of these. Let's see if I can find it. I think it was in part 2. Let's see.
And if you don't see it now, if you just shoot me an email, I'd be happy to.
Yeah,
write it
yeah.
into the
So
next
there, I
draft.
had just something on there that we're missing in this section, so it's either 1, 2, or 3. No greater.
Yeah, and I guess while she's looking for that, there's the mention of the word director. I know we have a specific title used in our code, what is it, community planning? Is that meant to be the director, or is a director a different designation that we give a definition for later in that, right?
There-
Like right there in that yeah, right, like right there in that where you're sharing, right? There's a word determined by the director.
Yeah, in
What-
this case, the director refers to the director of community development and planning. There is a definition in the definitions area that talks about what director means in this section.
I think I see it.
Yeah.
Two,
Yep.
second line. Maybe no greater than one space per employee and one space per 4 beds to accommodate staff and visitors.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what one space per 4 beds is.
Oh, it's a misspelling, should be 4 with a U.
Okay.
4 beds, okay.
Yeah. Something on there wasn't making sense. So yeah.
Okay, there's.
Okay. Yeah. So that's the issue.
Well, that's, that's supposed to be FOUR?
FOUR.
Okay,
Now we make that.
now it makes sense, yes.
All right. So next steps, at the April, next planning commission in April, there'll be a public hearing and hopefully a resolution to approve, resolution to recommend approval to council. And then the city council will be adopting in May, assuming everything goes smoothly, and then also in May, Department of Commerce certification. All right,
Month ahead of deadline.
Could you draft us a resolution statement for us? Normally that is provided. I just want to make sure that that is requested.
yeah, there'll be a staff report with the draft amendments and a resolution.
Okay, recommended resolution. Okay.
So are you still with us, Matt?
I'm still here. Are we done with questions on sections 4, 14, 16, and 17?
Nope, I think everybody's about worn out here.
Okay. Are there any good of the order items?
Can I make a suggestion when we have detailed code amendments, when you do your PowerPoint to have like the overall concept, describe it, and then show us in the slide presentation, the texting, or be able to do that when we're discussing, because it'd be easier than having to keep scrolling back and forth in our PDF deck.
I would like to do that. I'm a little unsure how to do that. If
Okay.
like some of these, like Title 17 zoning is like 20, I don't know what pages it is. It's 26 pages. I'm not sure how I could scroll.
Or if you could split out the key ones, like we had a bunch of definitions, each of those definitions, or, you know, like some of them, it just might make it easier for us to talk about and do it more in a concise order instead of jumping around as much.
Would it work instead to print out a copy of all the amendments to look through as I'm going through and kind of say, now I'm going through section whatever, I went through section whatever?
Yeah, yeah, and if we don't do it just by title, but we can get to the like, you know, it's 17.22 or 17.22.50, that just helps us find it quicker.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
We can also explore creating a PDF that has bookmarks and links, and you can just click through it.
Yeah, yeah, because we just had the titles hyperlinked as bookmarks in the PDF, and we didn't have the sub chapters or subsections.
Yeah, we'll explore options for that.
Thanks.
Anything else for the good of the order?
So I'll make a motion, we adjourn.
All in favor?
I.
Aye.
Meeting adjourned. Thank you so much. And sorry I couldn't be there in person.